Ellie Parker had always heard whispers about her grandmother's house. It wasn't that the old Victorian home was particularly sinister. Its faded yellow paint and sprawling, ivy-clad walls gave it a certain charm, almost like something out of a forgotten time. But there was something about it, the kind of something you couldn't quite place, but it lingered in the back of your mind when you were alone, or when the lights flickered just a little too much. Now, Ellie was living there. After her grandmother passed away, the house became hers. It was a quiet place in a sleepy town, surrounded by thick woods that seemed to swallow up the sun each evening. The kind of place where you could hear the wind whistle through the trees and feel a kind of stillness that made you aware of the world around you. But it was also a place that whispered to Ellie. She didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the memories of her grandmother or perhaps the house itself, but something felt off. The air felt heavier in the evenings, as though the house itself was holding its breath. It was on her second night in the house that the first noise came. It was just a faint rustling at first, like the sound of something shifting in the attic. Ellie froze, her heart skipping a beat as she lay in bed. The sound was almost too subtle to be sure of. She told herself it was just the old house settling. Houses creak and groan, don't they? But as the hours stretched on, the noise grew louder. At first, it was soft thumps, like footsteps moving across the floor above her. Then, a scraping sound, as if something heavy was being dragged across the attic floor. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She sat up in bed, eyes darting nervously around the room. It was 2 a.m., far too late for anyone to be walking around in the attic. She listened intently, trying to make sense of the sound. It was unsettling, but not enough to make her leave her bed and investigate. After all, who would? The house was old, and these noises were probably just part of its age, right? But as the sounds continued, a chill began to creep up her spine. Her grandmother's house had always been full of strange little quirks. Drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, lights that flickered when no one touched them, and doors that creaked open on their own. Ellie had always brushed it off, attributing it to the house's age and her imagination. But now, as she lay in the dark, the sound from the attic felt different, felt intentional. Someone was up there. She told herself it was probably the wind or maybe some animals nesting in the attic. But deep down, Ellie knew that this wasn't just the wind. No, this was something else. The noises grew louder, closer, like footsteps moving deliberately across the attic floor. Each step seemed to echo in the silence of the house, making her heart race. Her palms were clammy, and she pulled the blanket tightly around herself, trying to drown out the sound. She could still hear it, though. The scraping, the dragging. It was like something was pacing back and forth, just above her head. Ellie finally couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her phone from the bedside table and turned on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness of the room. Her hand shook slightly as she pushed herself up and stood by the bed. The house was eerily quiet now, the strange noises from the attic ceasing just as abruptly as they had started. But Ellie's heart still pounded in her chest. What was going on? She had to find out. Gathering her courage, she slowly walked to the door and crept into the hallway. The floorboards creaked under her feet, and she winced at the sound. The hallway was dark, the only light coming from the beam of her phone's flashlight. Ellie glanced nervously at the door to the attic, which was just a few feet away. It loomed at the end of the hallway like an open mouth, ready to swallow her whole. She swallowed hard. The house was silent again. Was it just her imagination, or had she really heard those noises? She shook her head and tried to dismiss the thought. She could just go to bed and pretend it never happened. But as she turned to go back to her room, she heard it again. A soft scraping followed by a thud, then another thud, and another. The noises were unmistakable now. Ellie's breath quickened. and she turned to face the door to the attic. There was no way she was going to ignore it this time. Slowly, she took a step forward, her heartbeat thudding in her ears. She reached for the door handle and hesitated, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal. Suddenly, the scraping stopped, and for a brief moment, everything was completely still. Ellie stood frozen, holding her breath. She couldn't explain it, but she felt like she wasn't alone. A shiver ran down her spine as her gaze locked onto the attic door. She couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her from behind it. With a deep breath, she turned the handle and slowly opened the door. The attic stairs creaked beneath her feet as she stepped inside. The beam of light from her phone illuminated the attic, casting long shadows on the old wooden beams and dusty crates scattered around the room. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. She exhaled, but her relief was short-lived. From the corner of the attic, something moved. A shadow flickered at the edge of her vision. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but Ellie's pulse raced. Her eyes darted around the attic, trying to find the source of the movement. But there was nothing. Her breath hitched in her throat. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, loud, heavy, and deliberate, echoed from above her. Slowly, Ellie's head turned upward, and her flashlight beam froze on the attic ceiling. She saw something, a dark shape, a figure. It was standing just beyond the reach of the light, the outline of a person or something that resembled one just out of view. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. Ellie stumbled backward, the flashlight trembling in her hand. She couldn't move, couldn't think. All she could do was stare at the space where the figure had been. Was it real? Then, a low, guttural whisper echoed through the attic, sending chills down her spine. "Get out!" And that's when Ellie realized she wasn't alone anymore. Ellie's heart was pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The words, "get out," still echoed in her mind. The voice so low and menacing that it seemed to crawl under her skin, scratching at her very soul. She stood frozen at the top of the attic stairs, the flashlight trembling in her grasp as it cast shaky beams of light onto the dusty wooden floorboards of the attic. For a few seconds, she thought she might be imagining things, that her mind had played some cruel trick on her. But the feeling of being watched, of something lingering in the darkness just beyond the reach of her flashlight, was too real to ignore. The attic was eerily quiet now, the only sound the steady drip of water from a leaky pipe somewhere in the corner. The figure, if it had ever been there, was gone. But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that it had never truly left, that whatever was in this house was still watching her. Her skin crawled as she slowly turned her head to scan the room. The light from her phone flickered over the scattered old furniture, the cobwebs in the corners, the forgotten relics of a time long past. She forced herself to move, taking one hesitant step after another, the wooden floor creaking beneath her feet. There was nothing up here, she told herself, just an old attic, just shadows and dust and the memories of a house that had seen far too many years. But as she moved deeper into the room, her gaze fell on something that made her blood run cold. A small, old rocking chair stood by the far wall. It was positioned in such a way that it faced the attic door, as though it were waiting for someone to sit in it. The chair was old, its paint chipped and faded, but it looked well maintained, almost as if someone had been taking care of it. For a moment, Ellie just stared at it, wondering if her grandmother had kept it up here for some unknown reason. Then, without warning, the chair creaked, just once, a long, drawn-out sound, like the faintest whisper of wood against wood. Ellie's eyes widened, and she stepped back, her mind racing. No one had been up here since her grandmother's passing. The house had been empty, and Ellie had only just moved in. But the chair, had it moved? Had had it made that noise on its own? No, she thought. It's just the house. Just the old wood creaking. But her hands were trembling now, and every instinct screamed at her to leave, to get out of the attic and back to her room, where she could lock the door and pretend none of this was real. But she couldn't. Not yet. Steeling herself, Ellie took another step toward the chair. As she did, the light from her phone flickered, casting dark shadows across the room. She paused, breathing heavily, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. The chair creaked again. It was louder this time, the sound unmistakable. The chair shifted as if someone or something had just sat down in it. Ellie's throat went dry. She knew she had to leave, but her legs refused to obey. She stood frozen in the middle of the attic, the beam of light from her phone trembling as she held it out in front of her, desperately searching for any sign of movement. And then she heard it again, a soft whisper, barely audible, drifting from the shadows in the corner. "Help me." The words were faint, almost drowned by the silence of the attic, but they were unmistakable. Ellie's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. It wasn't just the house settling. It wasn't just her imagination. There was something in this house, something that didn't belong. Suddenly, the rocking chair began to move, slowly at first, then faster, the creaking growing louder with each passing second. Ellie's eyes locked onto it, her breath catching in her throat as the chair rocked back and forth, an unseen force pushing it. Her heart raced, and for a moment, she thought she might faint, but she couldn't move. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the chair, which was now moving violently back and forth, as if someone or something was sitting in it, rocking with unnatural force. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the chair stopped, dead, still. The silence that followed was deafening, but Ellie didn't dare move. Her entire body was stiff with fear, her hands frozen at her sides. What was happening? Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just witnessed. She was terrified, but more than that, she was confused. There had to be an explanation. This couldn't be real. Couldn't. But deep down, Ellie knew it wasn't just her mind playing tricks. Something was happening in this house. Something that went far beyond simple creaks and groans. Just as she turned to leave, the attic door slammed shut behind her with a loud bang that made her jump out of her skin. The sound echoed through the house, sending a wave of panic rushing through her. She spun around, her eyes wide, her heart thudding in her chest. The door had been open just a moment ago. There was no one else in the attic, no one who could have closed it. It wasn't me, she thought, her voice shaking. Someone's here. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she approached the door, her hand reaching for the knob. But before she could even touch it, the whispers started again. Faint at first, but growing louder with every passing second. "Get out. You don't belong here." The voice was harsh now, filled with anger and desperation. Ellie's heart skipped a beat as she yanked on the door, but it wouldn't budge. No matter how hard she pulled, the door remained firmly shut. Panic rose in her chest. She was trapped. Her mind raced. There had to be another way out. The window. She turned quickly, her eyes darting around the attic. But as she moved toward the window, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They filled her mind, swirling around her like a storm. And then, the air grew cold. Too cold. Ellie froze in her tracks, her breath visible in front of her. The temperature had dropped suddenly, so fast that it took her a moment to register the change. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, her hands trembling as she turned slowly toward the far corner of the attic, where the shadows seemed to deepen. Her phone's light flickered again, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. And there, in the darkness, she saw something. A figure, a shadow standing just beyond the reach of the light. She couldn't make out its shape, but the outline was unmistakable. It was there, and it was watching her. Ellie's heart was hammering in her chest. Every muscle in her body screamed for her to run, to escape the attic, but her legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the very air in the room had thickened, pressing down on her, forcing her to stay frozen in place. The figure in the shadows didn't move. It was just there, standing still and silent, as if waiting for her to do something, to make a mistake. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she tried to make sense of it. It was just a shadow, she told herself. A trick of the light, perhaps. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The figure was too solid, too distinct. It had a presence, something dark and ancient that seemed to seep into the very walls of the house. Her eyes never left the shadow. It was tall, taller than any person she had ever seen, its outline blurred and shapeless, but there, and it was watching her. What is it? The question repeated in her mind over and over. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it. Her flashlight flickered once again, casting a brief, flickering light across the attic. The shadow seemed to ripple and distort for a moment before returning to its original form. Who are you? Ellie whispered, her voice trembling. The shadow didn't answer, but the temperature in the room dropped again, so sharply that Ellie's breath misted in front of her. She shivered, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth, but it did little to stop the chill that had taken root in the room. And then, in the silence that followed, the whispering began again. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with every passing second. The voice was soft and rasping, like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard, but beneath that, Ellie thought she could hear words. Leave, now. While you still can. Ellie's blood ran cold. The voice was coming from the figure, no, from the space where the figure stood, but the air around it seemed to hum with something else, something malevolent, something ancient. She took a shaky step back, but the moment her foot moved, the air around her seemed to shift. The attic felt closer, as if the walls were pressing in on her, squeezing her with invisible hands. Her pulse quickened, and her mind raced. What was this thing? What did it want from her? Her grandmother's house, the one she had grown up in, was becoming a nightmare, a prison of shadows and whispers. She needed to get out. She had to get away from this thing. Ellie turned back to the door, yanking on the handle with all her strength. It refused to budge. It was locked, but she hadn't locked it. Her mind reeled. Her vision blurred as panic flooded her senses. Why won't it open? The figure in the shadows didn't move, but Ellie swore she saw something shift in its presence. It was as though it was aware of her every thought, every action, and it was waiting, watching for her to make a move. It's too late, the voice whispered again, louder this time, its words dripping with malice. Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She was trapped. Suddenly, the attic felt even smaller. The walls closed in, and she could feel the weight of something heavy, something oppressive pressing down on her chest. Her heart raced, each beat louder than the last, like the drum of some ancient ritual. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the attic, looking for another way out. But there was nothing. No windows, no escape. The rocking chair. She hadn't noticed it before, but now her eyes fixed on it. It was in the corner of the room, facing the door, as if waiting for someone to sit in it. The chair hadn't moved since the last time she saw it, but the feeling in the room had changed. The air felt thicker now, colder. There was something about that chair that made her stomach churn. Ellie shook her head. She couldn't focus on the chair now. She had to think. She had to get out. The whispers in the room grew louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to communicate with her. Her thoughts scrambled in the chaos, But there was no clarity, no escape. The shadow seemed to grow, stretching, twisting as if it were alive, and Ellie could feel it pressing in on her. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. Dead silence. Ellie felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end as the room fell into an oppressive, suffocating quiet. She couldn't breathe. The air felt too heavy, too thick. Then, from the darkness, a new sound. A footstep. One slow, deliberate step. Ellie's heart stopped. The figure in the shadows was moving. No longer content to just stand and watch, the shape slowly began to take form, the darkness around it swirling like a storm. As it moved, the room seemed to shift, as if the space itself was being warped by its presence. Ellie didn't dare move. She couldn't move. Her feet felt glued to the floor, her legs like stone. The air seemed to crackle with static, a feeling of tension so thick it was suffocating. The shape took another step, another, and then another. It was closer now, closer than ever, and Ellie could see it more clearly now. The shadow wasn't just a shape, it had texture, it had substance. It was like an enormous dark cloak, with long, tattered edges that seemed to reach out, tendrils of shadow curling and swaying like living things. Ellie's breath hitched. She could see something in the cloak, something moving, something inhuman. A hand, a long, gnarled hand, pale as death, stretched out from the darkness, its fingers elongated and twisted, reaching toward her. Ellie's body surged into motion then, pure instinct, as if her mind had shut off all logic. She bolted toward the window, but the moment she reached the ledge, the air grew even colder, a cold so intense it made her skin sting. And that was when she heard it, the creaking. The floorboards beneath her feet groaned as if something massive was pressing down on them. Ellie froze. The hand was getting closer. Ellie's body was frozen in terror, her legs like stone, her hands trembling as she gripped the window ledge. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her body refused to obey. The air around her had thickened, as if every breath she took was weighed down by the oppressive presence in the attic. The shadow in the corner, the creature with the long, gnarled fingers, seemed to stretch even closer. Each step it took toward her made the walls of the attic feel like they were closing in tighter. Her vision blurred as panic set in, her heartbeat loud in her ears. The hand reached out again, its fingers twitching like the tendrils of some horrible creature. The cold it radiated was enough to freeze the blood in her veins. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she realized how close it was, just inches away from touching her. No, please no. The hand hovered for a second, and Ellie's heart raced, her body screaming for her to run, to move. But she couldn't. Her legs were as heavy as lead, and her feet felt glued to the floor, rooted to the spot. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the hand retreated. Ellie's eyes widened in shock. The figure in the corner was no longer there. For a moment, she was alone in the dark, the only sound the erratic beating of her heart. What is happening? Her mind was reeling. The figure, it was gone, but she knew it wasn't over. She could still feel it, lurking just out of sight, watching her every move. It was like a shadow, always waiting, always there. Ellie forced herself to turn around, her eyes scanning the attic, searching for any sign of movement, any indication of where the creature had gone. The attic was still, eerily still. There was no sign of the shadow. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she took a tentative step forward, her gaze darting from one corner to the other. Her pulse was pounding in her throat, and she could feel the sweat dripping down her back, the air thick and oppressive. Maybe it's gone. Maybe it's all just in my head. But Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was as if the very air around her was charged with something dark, something malevolent. Without thinking, she took another step toward the attic stairs, her eyes still scanning the room. The chill that had once filled the air was gone, but it left behind an unsettling sense of unease. Ellie's foot hovered above the first step, but before she could move, she heard something. A soft sound, a whisper. Ellie, her name. It was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. It was coming from above her, from the dark corner of the attic. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but it held an unmistakable sense of urgency. Ellie, come closer. She felt a shiver run down her spine. The voice wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the same rasping, menacing tone. This voice was smoother, gentler, almost coaxing, and yet it filled her with dread. Without thinking, Ellie took another step, her body moving of its own accord, as if the voice had reached into her soul and commanded her to obey. She felt like she was being drawn toward the corner of the attic, toward the place where the shadow had stood only moments ago. The stairs creaked beneath her feet as she moved, her every step deliberate, her body seemingly acting against her will. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. Come closer, Ellie. Ellie's mind was screaming at her to stop, but her feet carried her forward, one step at a time, until she was standing directly in front of the dark corner. The space was empty, no shadow, no figure, just the cold, damp walls of the attic, as silent as ever. But then, something shifted. Ellie felt it before she saw it. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. A soft, icy breeze seemed to circle around her, brushing against her skin like unseen fingers. She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the shadows in the corner seemed to darken, thickening, swirling like smoke. And then she saw it. A figure, no, not just a figure, but a presence, slowly emerged from the shadows. It was a woman. She was tall, impossibly thin, with long, tangled hair that hung like a veil around her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow, empty pits that seemed to swallow all light around them. The woman's mouth stretched into a twisted smile, her lips curling into something that looked more like a grimace. Her hands, long and bony, reached out, her fingers curling toward Ellie. Ellie tried to step back, but her feet wouldn't move. She was trapped, paralyzed by fear. You shouldn't have come here. The woman's voice was soft, almost mournful, but there was a terrifying edge to it. She took another step forward, and Ellie felt a cold breath wash over her. The woman's eyes never left hers, and Ellie could feel her presence like a suffocating weight in the room. You've awakened her, the woman whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising sound of Ellie's own heartbeat. And now, there's no escape. Ellie's mind raced. She needed to get away, to run, to scream, but her body remained frozen, unable to move. The air around her thickened, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. The woman's smile grew wider, impossibly wide, her lips stretching back to reveal a row of jagged, yellow teeth. She stepped closer, her body moving in unnatural jerks, as if the woman's movements were being controlled by something else, something dark. You've opened the door, Ellie, and now, you will never leave. Ellie's eyes widened in horror as the woman's figure seemed to warp, bending and twisting, as if she were made of shadows, her body dissolving into the air around her. The world seemed to spin, and the attic, once so familiar, became a nightmarish labyrinth of darkness and whispers. And then, just as suddenly as the woman had appeared, she was gone. Ellie collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. Her body shook uncontrollably, her mind reeling from the encounter. She had to get out. She had to leave this house. But the door, the stairs, they were all locked. Trapped. What is happening to me? The question echoed in her mind as the whispers began again, swirling around her, growing louder, filling the room with a deafening roar. The shadows in the attic seemed to close in around her, as if they were alive, reaching out for her. And then, she heard it, the soft creaking of the floorboards. The shadow was back. Ellie's pulse thundered in her ears, the sound of her rapid breathing drowning out the eerie silence of the attic. Her chest heaved with each desperate breath she took, and her body trembled, unwilling to obey the commands of her mind. The shadows, thick and alive, seemed to pull closer, as if aware of her fear, feeding on it. She dared not look at the corner again, knowing that if she did, she might see the woman there, her grotesque smile twisted in the darkness. The whispering had stopped, but the air was suffocating, oppressive. Ellie could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on her, and she knew she wasn't alone. She wasn't sure how much time had passed since the woman disappeared. Minutes? Hours? The darkness outside had deepened, and now, with no way to tell whether it was day or night, Ellie felt the isolation creep into her bones. What was that thing? The question echoed in her mind, and she tried to force herself to stand, to break free of the paralyzing fear that gripped her. She moved slowly, carefully, her legs stiff from the terror, but each step felt like it took everything she had. As she approached the stairs, the shadows in the attic flickered, as if they were alive, shifting, swirling. Ellie looked behind her and found herself face to face with a sight that made her stomach churn. The woman, but she wasn't standing in the corner anymore. No, she was standing right in front of Ellie. Her hollow eyes locked onto her with a look that made Ellie's blood run cold. She didn't smile this time. No, this time, her face was emotionless, blank, as if she were waiting for something. Waiting for Ellie to make the first move. Ellie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat felt tight, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Her heart pounded in her chest, her skin prickling with an overwhelming sense of dread. The woman's thin, bony fingers twitched, and for a moment, Ellie thought she could see her mouth move, but there was no sound, only that deep, suffocating silence. Then the woman's face shifted. Her lips parted just a little, and with it came a voice. A soft, distorted whisper that slid into Ellie's mind like ice on her skin. "I see you." Ellie recoiled, instinctively backing away, but her feet tangled, and she tripped, falling backward onto the cold floor. The woman's fingers twitched again, and Ellie could feel the air shift, as if something was reaching out for her, wanting her, demanding her attention. "You can't escape me." The voice reverberated in Ellie's skull, and she covered her ears, trying to block it out, but it was useless. The woman's presence was inescapable, an oppressive force that twisted reality itself. "You will never leave this place." Ellie's mind swirled with panic. The darkness around her seemed to pulse, alive and hungry. The shadows stretched and warped, crawling toward her like fingers reaching for her soul. The air felt thick, heavy, and Ellie knew that she was running out of time. She scrambled to her feet, eyes darting around the attic for any possible escape, but the shadows were everywhere. They closed in on her, suffocating her, and the whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices, all telling her the same thing. "You're mine now." Her breath came in short gasps as her eyes frantically searched the attic. The walls seemed to be closing in, and Ellie knew she couldn't stay here. But where could she go? Every corner seemed to lead back to the same place, the place where the woman stood, waiting. In a burst of desperation, Ellie spun toward the attic window. The glass was old, foggy, but it was her only hope. She ran for it, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the hollow space, her heart racing in her chest. But before she could reach it, a cold hand gripped her arm, its fingers digging into her skin like a vice. She screamed, but it was drowned out by the shrill noise that filled her head. The woman's cold, dead fingers tightened around her wrist, pulling her back. Ellie struggled, her other arm flailing, trying to break free, but the woman's grip was unyielding. "I told you, you cannot leave," the woman whispered in a voice that was no longer just a whisper. It was a scream, a distorted howl that echoed in Ellie's skull, reverberating like thunder. Ellie's chest tightened as the woman's cold breath washed over her, her skin crawling in disgust. She felt herself being dragged backward, her feet dragging against the floor as if something invisible were pulling her deeper into the darkness. With a final surge of strength, Ellie broke free, pushing herself away from the woman's grasp. She stumbled backward, her head spinning as the attic swayed around her. She didn't know how, but she managed to regain her footing. The woman stood still, her hollow eyes fixed on Ellie, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across her face. "You're not going anywhere." Ellie spun around and bolted for the stairs, her breath ragged, her body aching with the fear that was driving her forward. She needed to get out. She had to get out. But when she reached the stairs, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, standing at the top of the stairs, was another figure, a man. He was tall, wearing a tattered sailor's uniform. His eyes were wide and vacant, his skin pale and lifeless, like the woman. He didn't move, but his presence was overwhelming, like a weight in the air. Ellie felt her body freeze again, her heart hammering in her chest. Who is this man? Ellie's mind was racing. The man didn't say anything. He just stood there, his hollow gaze locked onto hers. She could feel the air around her grow colder, the shadows thickening in response. Ellie's body trembled with the urge to run, but the man didn't move. He simply stared, his eyes unblinking, and Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting. Suddenly, she realized something. The woman isn't alone. Ellie's blood ran cold as the realization hit her. There was more than one of them, more than just the woman who had haunted the attic. And they were both waiting for her. The attic was closing in on her. She could feel the walls pressing in, the darkness creeping forward, and the chilling realization that she might never escape. Ellie stood frozen, her eyes locked onto the pale figure of the sailor who now stood at the top of the stairs. His presence was suffocating, the weight of his gaze like a physical force that seemed to crush the very air around her. Every instinct in her screamed for her to run, to flee, but her legs felt heavy, like they were bound by invisible chains. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat louder than the last, as the sailor's vacant eyes seemed to bore into her soul. His clothes were torn, worn by time, and his skin was ghostly white, almost translucent. He didn't move, didn't speak, but the silence between them was deafening. What is he? Ellie thought, her mind racing. Who is he? The air around her grew colder, and she shivered uncontrollably. It was as if the temperature had dropped in an instant, and the shadows in the attic grew deeper, thicker, as though they were alive, responding to his presence. Ellie's breath came out in shallow gasps, her body trembling as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. Then the sailor's lips parted. His mouth opened slightly, and Ellie heard a sound, a faint whisper that crawled into her ears like a ghostly wind. "Help me." The words sent a chill down her spine, and Ellie's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to ask him what he meant, but the words died on her lips before she could speak them. The air around her felt thick, suffocating, and the weight of the silence pressed down on her chest. She wanted to move, to break free from this nightmare, but the sailor's gaze held her captive. as though she were trapped in a web spun from shadows and fear. "Help me!" The voice came again, softer this time, but there was an unmistakable urgency to it. Ellie's eyes darted to the woman, who now stood just behind the sailor. Her hollow gaze locked onto Ellie as well. The two figures seemed to be connected, as if they were a part of the same nightmare, a part of the same curse. Ellie's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The attic had always been a place of mystery, a place where her grandmother had warned her never to go. But now, standing in the middle of the room, with the sailor and the woman both watching her, Ellie realized that the attic was more than just a place of secrets. It was a place of horrors, a place where the past had come alive to torment her. The curse, the thought struck her like a bolt of lightning. The sailor and the woman, were they connected to the house? To her grandmother? To the nightmare she was trapped in? Ellie opened her mouth to speak, but the words died before they could escape. The sailor's empty eyes watched her, and the whispers filled her mind, louder now, overlapping, making it impossible to think clearly. She could hear the woman's voice, too, the soft, sickly whisper that made her skin crawl. "You can't leave." The sailor's face remained expressionless, but his eyes seemed to flicker with something almost human, like a memory. Pain. Ellie felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly replaced by terror. There was something deeply wrong about the way the two of them stood together, as though they were both trapped in this place, unable to move forward, forever bound to the attic and its dark history. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, until they were all she could hear. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was futile. The voices seemed to come from everywhere, from the walls, the floor, even the shadows that danced in the corners of the room. They were closing in on her, suffocating her. "Help me!" This time, the voice wasn't a whisper. It was a scream, a guttural cry that sent waves of fear crashing through Ellie's body. She stumbled backward, her legs giving way beneath her. Her heart hammered in her chest, and the darkness around her seemed to close in tighter, like a net tightening around her throat. The sailor took a step forward, his feet making no sound as they touched the floor. Ellie gasped, her eyes wide with fear. His expression was blank, but his eyes held something dark, something ancient. He was coming closer, and Ellie had no idea what he wanted. But she knew she couldn't stay here any longer. She had to get out. But when she turned to run, the woman stepped forward as well. Her cold, dead eyes were fixed on Ellie, her bony fingers twitching, as if beckoning her closer. "You can't leave." The woman's voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, an undeniable truth that sent a shock of terror through Ellie's body. She froze, her legs locked in place as if they no longer belonged to her. Her eyes flickered between the woman and the sailor, and in that moment, she realized something she had been too afraid to acknowledge before. This wasn't just a haunting, it was a trap. Ellie had walked into a nightmare that was not just hers, but the nightmare of the house itself. The sailor and the woman, the voices, the shadows. They were all part of a curse that had been lingering in the attic for generations. And now Ellie had become a part of it. She wasn't just trapped in the attic. She was trapped in the past, in a dark memory that refused to let go. The sailor took another step forward, his hand reaching out toward her. Ellie could feel the cold, the death, the centuries of suffering that radiated from him. The woman stepped closer, too, her eyes never leaving Ellie's. Her smile twisted into something dark, something hungry. "You can't escape." Ellie's heart stopped in her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs refused to move. The fear was too much, the air too thick. She was paralyzed, trapped in the attic with the woman, the sailor, and the darkness that had come alive to claim her. Suddenly, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, to swirl, as if the very walls were closing in. The air grew colder still, and Ellie's breath fogged in front of her. She felt her limbs grow numb, and the world around her seemed to blur, the edges of reality fading into nothingness. Then there was a sound, a deep, rumbling noise that seemed to come from below the floor, from somewhere deep within the house. It was a sound that Ellie recognized all too well, a sound that had haunted her dreams since she first moved in. A thud, then another, and another. The sound was growing louder, closer. It was coming from the basement. Ellie's mind screamed for her to run, but her body remained frozen. The sailor reached out for her, and just as his fingers grazed her skin, the ground beneath her feet trembled. The shadows twisted violently, the air thick with a sudden, suffocating force. And then the lights went out. The sudden darkness felt suffocating. Ellie's eyes darted around, but there was nothing to see. The attic had transformed into a void, a place where even the shadows seemed to retreat. The only sound she could hear was her own frantic breathing, growing more panicked by the second. Where did the light go? Her heart pounded against her chest, the frantic rhythm matching the chaos inside her mind. She could still feel the presence of the sailor, standing so close behind her, and the woman, whose hollow gaze seemed to follow her every movement. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The terror had gripped her throat. Suddenly, a low rumble echoed through the walls. The ground beneath her feet trembled, sending a wave of dread through her body. Ellie's legs shook, threatening to give way, but she steadied herself, forcing her feet to stay planted firmly on the ground. What was that? It sounded like the house itself was groaning, as though it were alive, stretching and creaking under the weight of some terrible force. Ellie swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. She was trying to make sense of the madness around her, but every second seemed to drag her deeper into the nightmare. Then, out of the blackness, a sound cut through the silence. Thud. It was distant at first, faint, but it grew louder with each passing second. Came from the basement. Ellie froze, her entire body tense with anticipation. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her feet refused to move. Thud. It was closer now, louder, and unmistakably real. The house was alive with the sound of something heavy and ominous moving beneath them. Ellie felt her skin crawl as she stood frozen in place. She couldn't explain it, didn't want to, but there was something in the house, something in the dark that was now awake, and it was hungry. Thud. It came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of scraping, like metal dragging against stone. Ellie's mind raced. What could it be? Was it the sailor, the woman, or something far worse, something older, more ancient than either of them? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden flickering of light. The dim glow of the attic lights buzzed to life, weak and unstable. Ellie blinked, her vision adjusting to the weak illumination, and she gasped at the sight before her. The woman stood just inches away, her face twisted in a grotesque grin, her eyes wide and unblinking. The sailor was behind her, as still and silent as ever, but now there was something in the way they stood together, something malevolent. "You can't escape," the woman whispered, her voice cold and chilling. Ellie recoiled, her pulse racing. She took a step back, then another, but her movement was slow, as if the air itself had thickened, making every motion a struggle. Her legs felt like lead, and her thoughts were clouded by the whispers that seemed to grow louder with each passing second. "Help me!" The sailor's voice was a rasp, and it cut through the tension in the air. Ellie couldn't tell if it was a plea for help or an order. It was impossible to know. She swallowed hard, trying to force her body into motion. She needed to get out, The house was no longer safe. The attic, the walls, everything was suffocating her. "You'll never leave," the woman whispered, her voice full of malice. Ellie could feel her heart pounding in her ears, the adrenaline coursing through her veins, urging her to act. She glanced over her shoulder, looking for the door, the escape she so desperately needed. But just as she turned, the lights flickered again, and for a brief, terrifying moment, everything went dark. When the light returned, the room had changed. The shadows were deeper, darker, and there was something in the corner of the attic, something that hadn't been there before. Ellie's breath caught in her throat as she saw it. A shadowy figure, tall and unnaturally thin, standing against the far wall. Its face was hidden in darkness, but its presence was undeniable, its power overwhelming. She felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, and before she could turn, she heard the scraping sound again. It was closer now, much closer. The figure in the corner stirred, its long, thin limbs moving in unnatural jerks, like a marionette being controlled by an unseen hand. "You should have never come here," the figure whispered, its voice a raspy hiss. Ellie stumbled backward, her hands trembling as she reached for the door. The figure in the corner moved again, its limbs twitching unnaturally, and Ellie couldn't take it anymore. She turned and ran. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to escape. The stairs creaked beneath her feet as she sprinted down, desperate to get away from whatever was in that attic. She could hear the whispers following her, the scratching sounds growing louder with each step. It was as though the house itself was coming alive, pulling her deeper into its grip. She reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The house was eerily silent now, as though it were holding its breath. Ellie glanced back up the stairs, her eyes wide with fear. She could still hear the whispers, but they were fading, and she wondered, was it all in her head? Was the attic just a place of her nightmares? Or was something real, something ancient, truly trapped within those walls? Ellie couldn't stay in the house another moment. She ran out the door, not bothering to lock it behind her. Her heart was still racing, her breath shallow, and her legs aching from the effort. She needed to get away, to escape whatever had followed her here. But as she turned the corner of the house and saw the street beyond, she froze. The world around her had changed. The house she had just fled from was now surrounded by fog. Thick, swirling mist rose up from the ground, wrapping itself around the house like a living entity. Ellie's eyes widened in horror. She could see the figure from the attic standing just beyond the mist, watching her, its face still hidden in shadow. "You can't escape," the figure whispered again, its voice colder than ever. Ellie stumbled backward, her mind reeling. The nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Ellie's chest tightened as she staggered backward, her eyes locked onto the shadowy figure emerging from the fog. The thick mist seemed to swirl and pulse around the house like a living, breathing entity, and the figure stood within it, its long, thin limbs stretching unnaturally, its face still hidden in the darkness. Her heart thudded loudly in her ears. She could feel the icy grip of panic creeping up her spine, but she couldn't afford to give in to fear. Not now. Not after everything she had endured. She turned her back to the figure, her legs trembling as she ran, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The street ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the fog thickening with every step, making it harder and harder to see. The only sound was the pounding of her heart and the soft, whispering voices that seemed to echo from the mist. "You can't escape." Ellie's mind raced. She couldn't let it catch her. She couldn't let the house, the curse, drag her back in. She pushed herself harder, her feet slipping on the damp pavement, the voices still swirling in her head like a haunting melody. "You can't escape." The words seemed to seep into her very soul, twisting her thoughts, making her doubt her own sanity. Every part of her body screamed to run, to get as far away as possible. But something inside her refused to stop. She couldn't let the figure win. She couldn't let the house take her again. Her legs burned with exhaustion as she sprinted down the street, but it felt like the fog was closing in, pushing her back toward the house. She glanced over her shoulder, and the figure was still there, no longer hidden in shadow, but standing right at the edge of the mist, its face still obscured by darkness. Suddenly, her foot caught on something. She stumbled forward, her body lurching to the ground. Her hands scraped against the pavement as she tried to catch herself, but the fall left her disoriented, her vision spinning. She gasped for air, trying to shake the fog from her mind. She tried to push herself up, but the voices grew louder, more insistent. "You can't escape." The words filled her ears, drowning out everything else. Ellie's heart raced as she fought to clear her head. She couldn't give up. She had to keep going. She forced herself to stand, her knees shaking beneath her, and when she looked up, the figure was closer. The fog had parted around it, revealing its true form. It was tall, unnaturally tall and thin, its limbs elongated like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Its face remained hidden, but Ellie could feel its gaze burning into her. She felt its presence inside her mind, its weight pressing down on her chest. "Help me," the whisper came again, but this time it was not from the figure. It was from within the fog, from the house, from somewhere deeper. Ellie's heart skipped a beat. Could it be the sailor? Was he still trapped inside the house? For a brief moment, she considered turning back, racing toward the house to see if she could free him. But the thought made her stomach churn. She knew she couldn't. If she went back, she would be lost forever. The curse of the house would consume her, just as it had consumed the sailor and countless others before her. "You can't escape." Ellie took a deep breath, pushing the thought aside. She could feel the fog closing in again, the air thick and suffocating. She had no choice but to keep moving forward. She didn't know where she was going, but the instinct to run drove her forward. The figure continued to follow her, its eerie whispers growing louder, more frantic. It was closing in on her, gaining on her with every step she took. Her legs felt like lead, her breath ragged as she stumbled forward. But in the distance, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. The outline of a building, a small cottage just beyond the fog. Could it be another house? Or was it a mirage created by the fog and her exhaustion? "You can't escape." The whisper came again, and this time, Ellie was certain it was from inside her own mind. The house, the curse, was still with her. It would never let her go. She had to find a way to break free, to break the cycle. With every ounce of strength she had left, Ellie pushed forward, her feet moving faster as she neared the cottage. The fog had become suffocating, but she could see the faint outline of the door, the light shining from within. She reached it in what felt like an eternity, and her hand shakily gripped the door handle. The whispering voices were so close now, she could feel them inside her head, their cold fingers wrapping around her thoughts, tightening their grip. But she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Ellie twisted the door handle and pushed it open, stumbling inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the fog seemed to retreat, and the whispers faded into the distance. She collapsed against the door, gasping for air, her body trembling with exhaustion. The room around her was dimly lit, and for a moment, she thought she had found refuge. But as her eyes adjusted, she realized something terrible. The room wasn't empty. There, sitting in the corner of the room, was the same figure she had seen before, the same tall, thin shape with the hidden face. It didn't move, but it was watching her with eyes that she could feel burning into her soul. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered, its voice chilling. Ellie's heart stopped. She had thought she escaped. She had thought she was safe. But the figure's voice told her everything she needed to know. There was no escape. Not from the house. Not from the curse. And certainly not from the figure that had been chasing her for so long. The room seemed to close in on her as the figure slowly stood, its long, thin limbs reaching out toward her. Ellie's body screamed in terror, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed by fear, by the realization that she was trapped. The curse had found her, and this time there would be no escape. As the figure's hand reached for her, Ellie closed her eyes, waiting for the darkness to consume her. The cold fingers brushed her skin, and for a moment, she felt the weight of 1,000 souls pressing down on her. And then, everything went black.